Here we are. Okay, we'll start that again. Good morning. My name is Jonathan Roper. I am the president of the St. Louis Metro section of the APA, and we're here for the November 2020 luncheon, the virtual luncheon. Just because of COVID, we switched our programs for the remaining part of this year and part of next year at least to virtual. So today we are joined by author Vivian Gibson, and she is the author of The Last Children of Mill Creek, a wonderful book that you can pick up at Left Bank Books here in St. Louis. And this will be worth one CM credit. Also, and I apologize for the title, we will have a raffle for the books that the APA has to give out to members for free, just as we did the Citizen Brown book at the last month's meeting. And if I could ask everyone just to remain on mute, just so we have cancel out a little background noise there. And there we go. Okay, we'll have books to give away. If you would like to email me at jroper@allaboutmo.com. I know a number of you have contacted, you responded to the email during the registration for that, so we'll be getting in touch with you shortly. But we have signed copies of The Last Children of Mill Creek to give away, and the author was kind enough to sign the copies outside Left Bank Books. So that was a pretty fun meeting the author and for a book signing there. Before we get started, just a few other things to note. We have the UMSL Chancellor Certificate in Planning and Zoning going on now. It's a 7-course module with UMSL, ULI, the APA, and East West Gateway. And many of you guys actually are instructors as well, so I thank you for that. But if you know of any of your boards or commissioners who need to have a little bit more training or to get accustomed to different roles of being a planning or board commissioner, this is the opportunity for you. We host this usually in the fall, sign up starts normally in October. So we have this one along with the sister project. We have the UMSL Economic Development Certificate, which more will be coming to you probably in December of this year. Of course, always thank our sponsors who help us bring great planning programming, including one of the items that their sponsors um, support are the books that we give away to our members here. So thank you for all those, including CBB, Holland, CMT, Alta, the I5 Group, the Lockmuller Group, St. Louis University, RDG USA, and SWT Design. So thank you guys for all sponsoring this section. And finally, I would note that the American Planning Association, the Missouri chapter, has called have their nominations for the Great Places in Missouri. The Great Places in Missouri, and I'm going to look to the Great Places in Missouri. They recognize outstanding, whether it be stop my screen share real quick and go to this website page that has more information on the Great Places. Um, so there are two different Great Places, just so you're not confused with the Great Places in America. So the APA National puts on Great Places in America. So does the Missouri State chapter. And the section supports on the local level getting in touch with the planners as yourselves to submit for these awards and to recognize, and to encourage you guys to submit your neighborhoods. Um, right now, we're looking for the great places in Missouri, which I believe are due on December the 6th. And that could be found on our website, and I'll throw it in the chat in just a little bit. So we had a number of places that were already designated by Missouri, including like the Grove, Forest Park, Washington Avenue, Old Orchard, and Webster Groves, downtown Kirkwood, South Grand. But we're looking for more. 2020, we actually did not have one designated to us. So in 2021, let's look to make that happen. Basically, the great places in Missouri, it could be found. They have a nomination form on their website, and it's it's pretty not a bad not a bad form. It's just one form, a one-page nomination description, some photos, and the description really needs to include why or how planning makes this place great. So if you have those, or you if you're unsure about a place and you're like, well, maybe not, please get in contact with myself or even Ashwarya. She's the new Missouri chapter representative who will be glad to help you with that, or myself as well. So let's start submitting those great places. And finally, our December luncheon. This year, unfortunately, the APA will not have a holiday in-person party. I know, with COVID going on, that's where many of our focuses are and staying safe and socially distanced. So, unfortunately, we will not have the holiday um, festivities. However, we will still have a December luncheon. We're looking to do something a little bit more different than just the great presentations we've been having, but we're the board is still coming up with the programming for that. So please look for your weekly e-blast and the website for more information on that. But otherwise, at this point, I believe, Vivian, if you're ready to go, and I believe you have been made a co-host, that I will give it over to you.
Thank you. And thank all of your members. This is a great experience today. I do quite a number of these virtual book discussions, presentations, interviews. But I want you all to know that I changed everything for you. I thought usually we're just talking about the book, but I thought given your group's um, profession, professions, I thought that maybe I would change this a little bit just to give some idea about the politics and the policies that went on in the background behind my book. So I've kind of jumped the gun a little bit. I'm going to open up some slides here. Oops, I didn't need to do that so quickly. I didn't know I was going to disappear. Let's see. Um, I hope I can go back. Let's see. Okay, here I am. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, we can see you, but no presentation. Are you doing?
Well, I took the presentation off because I wasn't
okay.
ready to disappear.
Gotcha.
So I'm really happy to be here. My book is a memoir about my life, my family's life in a part of St. Louis called Mill Creek Valley. It was downtown St. Louis, uh, basically the central corridor for many, many years. And it's a story about how we lived and how we functioned as a family, as a community. And it's told from the perspective of a young girl, me, from ages about 4 years old to about 10. So instead of talking about the book, although we can do that if your members have had a chance to read it toward the end of my presentation, I'd like to just really talk to you as city planners, urban planners about urban renewal, that sort of thing that happened in St. Louis from really early 1900s, from 1907 until today. So if you don't mind, I will start my presentation. And I'll remind you that I'm not great at this. So I hope I can do it justice. So I'm going to go with these slides. I hope that okay, can we see them?
Not yet.
Okay, maybe I didn't share. I think that's probably what happened. I was supposed to go here, I think. Oh, I knew this was going to happen. Let's see.
At the bottom where you hit share screen and then a new window should pop up.
Okay, I got the slides, share. Did that work?
We're on your PowerPoint. Yes.
Yeah, is there a picture of the book?
Yes.
Okay, then it says childhood is for most of us where our true home resides. Is that where we are?
We are.
Okay, you have to help me through this. If it looks weird, tell me because I don't always know. So this is the cover of my book, and that's me at around 7 or 8 years old when I was observing all the things I write about in the book. And so my warning to you all who are parents or going to be parents, remember children are watching and they might write a book later on about it, so be careful. So this is Mill Creek Valley. This is some of what it looked like where I lived as a child. This is the rear of houses. It's one of the oldest parts, or was one of the oldest parts of St. Louis. A lot of the architecture was similar to housing in Old North St. Louis and Soulard. There were lots of alleys and backyards with outhouses and coal sheds and wooden stairs that went up to the second and third level. The land was first developed, of course, as we know, by the Osage Nation and at the confluence of the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers. It had been home to new European immigrant groups who arrived in the city for the previous 150, 200 years. Before we go too far, I think I'd like to read something from the book to just introduce you to my family. When I was in college, I read about the wave of African Americans who left the South by the thousands during the first Great Migration between 1900 and 1940. My parents never mentioned it, but they were part of the exodus. They arrived in St. Louis 8 years apart and under very different circumstances. Daddy came around 1929 with his mother and stepfather from rural Arkansas so that he could attend high school. There was no high school for Blacks anywhere near his town in Arkansas, and he was the first of his extended family to go beyond third grade. St. Louis was a hostile city for Black Americans, a former hub of the slave trade, with established customs, state laws, and zoning policies that mandated segregated schools and neighborhoods. Nonetheless, They considered their move a step up from the impoverished sharecropping life they left behind just one state away in the South. Mama came 8 years later. She was pampered. She was a pampered middle-class college student from a small Alabama town where her father, a successful farmer, owned the Colored's grocery store. She came to St. Louis to visit relatives while on summer break. After my parents met that summer and again the next winter break, they soon married. My mother's life changed dramatically. They settled into a Negro neighborhood in downtown St. Louis called Mill Creek Valley and had 8 children in rapid succession during the decade of the 1940s. So that is the environment and the situation that my mother found herself in. She came from this very small town where her family was fairly well off. She went to college, presumably to find a professional husband, but came to St. Louis and met my father, who was a truck driver and a quartet singer, and got married. And her life took off in a very different direction. And I think her father was probably a tad disappointed in her. So for you city planners, this might look familiar to you. This is a map of Mill Creek. There's no map in the book, so a lot of people, even though I give the boundaries, somehow people just can't imagine where this part of the city was. On this fourth side here to the west is Grand Avenue. So anything on the west side of Grand is St. Louis University. Anything on the east side of Grand is Mill Creek Valley. This is the map that was used during the planning of the demise of Mill Creek. Along this long line here is Olive Boulevard. It starts at Lindo and then it changes to Olive and goes all the way down to about 22nd Street, just before you get to Union Station. On the east side, of course, 22nd Street, and then you come all the way over to which is probably the train tracks that run parallel to Highway 6440. Now you know those train tracks. That's the southernmost boundary of Mill Creek. Although there are people who think that the boundaries went all the way to Choteau, and on the north side all the way to Washington Avenue. But I think for the purposes of the renewal, the urban renewal that was going on, this section became Mill Creek for most people. Right down the middle is Market Street. So Market Street no longer goes to Grand, but it used to. But it now goes all the way down the middle of what was Mill Creek. It was also really the heart of the city. You can see this is Jefferson. In the book, I write a lot about us crossing the Jefferson Bridge to go to school, to do things, to go to Soulard Market, that sort of thing. This arrow here shows where our house was. It was just west of Jefferson, between Leffingwell and Jefferson. And a lot of my life, a lot of what happens in the book goes on in this little section of this map. Our church was here. This is what is now Harris Stowe State University. Then it was Vashon High School, where my father left the South to go to school on his way here. It was only the second African-American high school for Blacks after Sumner High School in St. Louis. And people came from as far as South City, from Webster, from all over to go to either Sumner or Vashon High School if they were Black. Let's see. You can see along here, this is Lindell and Olive. All of this red were commercial industry, like factories, and a lot of the people who lived, you can see how densely populated it was. A lot of the people who lived here actually worked in these factories, in these stores, so they could actually walk. It was a walking community for sure. But there were streetcars, not a lot of buses, but a lot of streetcars. Let's see what else is on here that might be interesting to you. My school where I went to kindergarten is right here. It was actually two buildings, Lincoln Elementary School. It's at 22nd and Walnut. And the back was Eugenia Street. And what's happening there right now today is the soccer stadium. So where I went to elementary school to kindergarten is now, maybe they should call that Mill Creek, that stadium. Don't you think they should name that stadium Mill Creek Soccer Stadium? Because it's right in the middle of what was Mill Creek. The other interesting thing is that, again, these are railroad tracks, but before they were railroad tracks, they were the Mill Creek. There actually was a creek. Bridges, this is a Jefferson Bridge. I think this might be the 14th Street Bridge. This is a bridge that doesn't exist anymore called the Ewing Bridge. There used to be a bridge that extended from Ewing Avenue that went all the way across to Shoto. And children, Black children, who lived on the south side on Rutger and Russell and those streets, Hickory, they would walk to the Ewing Bridge, walk across the bridge to Vashon High School. So it was about 6 blocks this way and another 2 blocks there to go to high school. That bridge does not exist anymore. I've driven down there lately and it's just a dead end street. Let's see what else is here. There are lots of churches. There were 40 churches in Mill Creek, all destroyed, and 20,000 people. I don't know how that got there. Let's see. There we go. So I talked about the Mill Creek. This is the creek. This is basically the map I just showed you that shows the creek before the railroad tracks. It started at approximately Shoto and Vandervenner around Spring. And it was a natural spring that came from the Rock Spring, which is probably why Spring is called Spring up there. Around 39th Street in Spring. It meandered down through that middle part of the city. This is Shoto here. This is Market Street, I think, right about here, still at an angle. It was called Shoto Pond initially because all of this land belonged to August Shoto. During that time. They dammed the creek to create this mill. And the dam created a lake or a pond. And this was the site of the first city park in St. Louis because it had this beautiful pond or kind of a lake, and it was all very beautiful. It was a valley. People had cows and all kinds of things that grazed along the pond and the mill. And some of the nicer homes that belonged to Laclede and Shoto and all of those early settlers were right around this pond. And then it goes all out into the Mississippi River. Let's see where we are here. So I thought I'd talk to you city planners about the city plan for St. Louis, the very first. It was 1907, and St. Louis actually had one of the first comprehensive city plans in the country. It was a document that talked about creating parks and vistas and neighborhoods that were linked together, a huge downtown park that would showcase the river, which was the major asset of the community, was the Mississippi River, and it was lined with factories and packing houses and smoke, and it was all dirty, and river boats, warehouses. And around 1907, which was probably about 150, a little less than 150 years from when the city was founded, it was decided there needed to be a major plan for making the city healthier and more beautiful. And it was, I read part of that plan, and it was the first time that I saw the reference to, and it may have been the first reference to that downtown area being called a gateway. It was in that 1907 document, which I thought was very interesting because we now think of the arch as the gateway to the west, but they were calling it a gateway that far back. Another name that some of you might know is Harold Bartholomew. He was the city planner from 1916 to 1950. And in doing my research, I had read about the city plan, but I read an interesting book called The Broken Heart of America by Walter Johnson that writes a lot about Missouri and specifically St. Louis. And he writes considerably about Harold Bartholomew and his time as city planner. He was known as the father of American urban planning. Bartholomew's city plans shaped the history of St. Louis down to the present day. His thought or his philosophy was to take it, tear it down, and bury the memory, according to Walter Johnson. So what I did was I borrowed from Decoding the City, a website that goes into extensive discussion about St. Louis City, St. Mill Creek. I borrowed a timeline that I thought was very interesting and illustrative of what occurred in the background of my book. My book is about a family, stories about how we lived, but I don't talk a lot about what I'm going to present to you today, but it certainly is in the background, and people need to understand, and I hope they do understand the history. Somebody has
look up other places, and it says
the history of what was happening in St. Louis. So I don't know if you can see this also, I will read most of it. So the timeline from Decoding the City. 1913, a committee of white St. Louisans called for legal segregation of Negroes in St. Louis. In 1916, the St. Louisans voted on a reform ordinance that would prevent anyone from buying a house in any neighborhood more than 75% occupied by other races. It became the first referendum in the United States to impose racial segregation on housing, passing by 2/3. In 1917, the United States Supreme Court rules that racially restricted zoning is unconstitutional, striking down St. Louis's ordinance. Private real estate covenants began to effect the same outcome using contracts. So they passed the law in 1916, and 1 year later, the Supreme Court said it was unconstitutional. But realtors took up the mantle and decided to put those covenants in real estate contracts in 1917. A lot went on between 1917 and 1933, but in a significant way, Homeowners Loan Corporation is founded and creates a residential security map to color code for insuring private mortgages. Black neighborhoods are rated the lowest, ensuring no insurance of mortgages there. This is the inception of redlining in the United States. So St. Louis was on the front line of creating the whole concept of redlining in real estate. In the St. Louis Star and Time, as early as June 1827, articles were appearing about the fear of Black people moving into white neighborhoods. This is a headline that I pulled off of newspaper.com. Unscrupulous real estate agents of both races blamed for influx of Negroes into white districts. So there was, though it was not legal to discriminate, there was a lot going on to promote it and encourage it, for sure. In 1940, by this time, neglectful white slumlords and declining city services had allowed parts of Mill Creek Valley to decay into a rat-infested, that's quote, rat-infested residential slum. There was a lot of persuasion going on about how bad this community was, so that when it was when the decision time came for voters to vote to demolish this neighborhood, they had plenty of evidence that it was worthy of being demolished. In 1948, Shelley versus Kramer, Supreme Court case based in St. Louis, ends racial covenants nationwide. So those realtors who put those restrictions into their contracts were outlawed in 1948. In 1949, the year I was born, President Truman signs the U.S. Housing Act, designed to, quote, bring hope and help to the cities and bring private enterprises into the redevelopment process, end quote. This act federally funds clearance of entire urban neighborhoods for the first time. Negro invasions have cost $25 million. Hellman, that's a lot of M's and N's and N's, says. This was a realtor, Mr. Hellman was a realtor who, again, was leading the charge to persuade white homeowners that Black people being in their neighborhood was a death knell. These photographs here are pictures of homes in Mill Creek. This looks like Lafayette Square. There were 20,000 people in Mill Creek, but it was a self-contained, segregated community that had very nice homes, had professional people with good paying, decent paying jobs, I should say, teachers and lawyers and doctors and the ministers and the churches. Everybody lived in that neighborhood. So it was not a complete slum. There were some very beautiful homes. As you can see here, this particular home at the bottom here belonged to George I. Barnett. It was at 2605 Lawton, which was just west of Jefferson, which would now put it right in the middle of Wells Fargo, that whole Wells Fargo complex. Barnett was a St. Louis architect. He designed hundreds of buildings in St. Louis, including the buildings in Tower Grove Park, the Missouri Botanical Gardens. The Southern Hotel was a very well-known hotel around the turn of the century. Barnett was born in England and lived in St. Louis until 1890. And this was his home in Mill Creek. So this shows you that Mill Creek kind of progressed from a well-to-do community in some sections of it. He had the house built in 1867 and lived there until he died in 1890. I checked the 1940 census, and in 1940, it was a rooming house with 14 residents, all Black. In 1950, Plaza Urban Renewal Project announced dilapidated slum area within a few blocks of City Hall, the Civil Courts Building, Central Library, and the rail station. In 1950, they finally got the money from President Truman in 1947. And one of the first projects was to build the Plaza Square projects, which are those buildings on pine and olive that have all the various colors on the buildings. That was the first project. And the area that they tore down was called Chestnut Valley. And it was a Black neighborhood but it was more than just a neighborhood. It was an entertainment and what they call sporting life neighborhood. So they had bars and theaters and ladies of the evening and lots of money changing hands. But it was so close to City Hall. That was the first area that they tore down. So they tore down, I think, from about 14th Street up to about 22nd Street, and from Olive to Market Street. And so that grassy area, that little park that goes along Market Street was all part of that Chestnut Valley. Over the next 2 decades, 60,000 African Americans will leave the city. In 1951, Urban Redevelopment Corporation of St. Louis forms to implement the Plaza Square apartments east of Mill Creek. That was what I was just talking about. Excuse me. In 1954, Mayor Raymond R. Tucker announced plans to demolish the 5,600 dwellings across 465 acres of Mill Creek Valley, running west from Union Station to St. Louis University. So it was in 1954 when they finally got a bond issue passed and was able to announce that they would be buying up all of that property and demolishing it with the idea of putting in parks and a highway and other beautiful houses that mostly never. Let me see, I have some other notes here. We talked about her. Okay, in 1955, St. Louisans widely approved the $10 million bond issue for demolition, endorsed by the local NAACP as well, after the federal government promised it would reimburse the city. The city was reimbursed by the federal government, I think, for about 2/3 the cost of demolishing Mill Creek. In 1959, the demolition started at 3518 Laclede Avenue, which just happened, I'll go back to the map, which just happened to be, let's see if I can get it, about right here, which was basically the first land that St. Louis University took over. So before anything, they cleared out the land for St. Louis University. That first house that they demolished was just a block from Grand in what looked like was a pretty open field that was already probably belonged to St. Louis University. Let's see. Where am I here? So 1959 in February was the beginning of the demolition. In 1964, Laclede Town Apartments were built. So it took 5 years to really build something on that land. I think at this point, I want to read another section from the book because it kind of ties into what we're talking about here. From the book, the 1907 city plan for St. Louis was one of the first comprehensive development city plans in the United States. The study focused on making St. Louis cleaner and healthier for its growing population and a more attractive city for visitors. The report proposed ambitious infrastructure improvements beginning with the Natural Gateway at the Mississippi riverfront. It included plans for open green spaces, European-inspired municipal buildings, and modern homes among the undulating hills spreading west, north, and south. There was little mention in that initial plan of the Negro residents that made up only 6.2% of the central city population at that time. Aldermen passed a final measure on the Mill Creek plan on March 21st, 1958, by a 27-1 vote. The lone dissenter was Alderman Archie Bland, Democrat, who initially supported the project. In the debate preceding the ballot, Bland pointed out that 97% of Mill Creek is in my ward. That was a quote. He charged that no adequate provisions for rehousing the area's low-income residents were in place. This is another quote. "I'm in favor of better housing, but not in favor of slums moving to other slums. Moving to other parts of the city," he protested. The local League of Women Voters, the Archdiocese of St. Louis, and eventually the NAACP endorsed the mostly federally funded project. 8 months later, the first wrecking ball struck in Mill Creek and permanently destroyed a viable neighborhood of 20,000 people. In 1995, they built Laclede Town. They built Laclede Town in 1964. In 95, they demolished it. It was a kind of an experiment of an integrated kind of quote bohemian neighborhood, but it didn't last very long, and most of that land now belongs to either St. Louis University or Harris Stowe. And as I mentioned earlier, in 2020, MLS Soccer Stadium commenced building in Mill Creek Valley. Let's see. So that was what was going on in the background of my stories. The story was, my book is about my family. This is my family. My mother, my father, and my 7 siblings. I talk about our adventures in segregation, in school, in our community, in our church, with our teachers. And This is us around 1955. My entire family joined the NAACP, and a photographer from the Argus newspaper came and took our picture. This is my siblings. I wasn't born yet on this one. I talked about my father leaving Arkansas, and this was the last picture they took in Arkansas on his way to go to high school. This is my father, his mother, and her husband at the time, Mr. Hodges. This is my older brother, Randall, and his 8th grade education. So the point of my book was to show that there were people, there was some humanity in that segregated community. I talked to lots of people these days who said that they didn't even know Mill Creek existed. They didn't know that 20,000 people were in this community. Some people said that they had heard the name, but they didn't know where it was. So I'm really happy that I'm able to introduce people to the entire community and show that we had institutions and churches and culture and family life. This is my parents when they were soon after a few years after they were married, my older sister Laverne and my older brother Randall. That's Laverne there, and that's Randall. And that's my father. My father was an only child, and he thoroughly enjoyed having a family. He was hardworking. He was a truck driver by day. He was a quartet singer on the weekends and a church janitor. So he had lots of jobs. I've never known him to have less than 2 and sometimes 3 jobs at a time. These are the buildings, some of the buildings in Mill Creek that were destroyed. This was City Hospital number 2. This was the colored hospital. The City Hospital number 1 is still located on Lafayette Street. It is now a condominium, but those were the 2 city hospitals. The one on Lafayette was number 1, and this was number 2. This building that was located on Garrison and Locust was a former medical school for Barnes Hospital. This is a scene on Market Street. You can see the tower of Union Station. You can see how close we are. This sign here that you can't read says Strand Theater. That was one of 3 movie theaters that we had. This was at about 20th Street and Market. You can see the City Court building here. And I think this is the Southwestern Bell building. So all those other things aren't there yet. So I would think this is somewhere around the late 1940s, early 1950s. Let's see. This is the People's Finance Building. It was a building built and financed by Black people. It was the heart of Mill Creek at the intersection of Market and Jefferson, where Wells Fargo stands today. It's interesting, this was the People's Finance Building, and now the building there has a lot to do with finance. That's kind of interesting. But it had a dance hall on the top where there were dances and weddings and conventions and all kinds of things. It had all the doctors, the lawyers, both Black newspapers, the American and the Argus, were housed here. There were drugstores, there was a cafeteria in the basement. And so it was the heart and soul of Mill Creek. This is a beautiful church, which is the only of 40 churches, the only church still standing in Mill Creek Valley. This picture, it says here in the corner, 7 1954. So this was July 1954. This is Pine Street that it's facing. That church now belongs to St. Louis University. This front entrance to the church is all cemented over. There's a fence around it, and it faces the rear entrance to a student dormitory on Harris Stowe's campus. When I went a few months ago to take a picture of the church, there were 2 dumpsters in front of it, and this fence, and pretty much overgrown. The front of the church is now facing Olive. It still belongs to St. Louis University. It's a conference center. And if you ever go to Pappy's Barbecue and you look directly east, that's the church. It kind of sets back, but most people don't realize it. And it is the only church that remains from Mill Creek. And it only survived because there was a committee of architects at Washington University School of Architecture who were assigned the responsibility to identify a church to stay. And this church was affiliated with the white Second Presbyterian Church, and it survived, although its congregation disappeared because there was nobody around, and it probably only survived for another 10 years. It was called Berea Presbyterian Church. This is the Ross family house. We don't really have a full picture of the house. My brother drew this picture of the house. It was 3 rooms. There was no hot running water. There was running water, but it wasn't hot. So we had to boil water to bathe, to wash clothes, to do anything. My grandmother lived upstairs. She owned the house. She bought it in 1955. 4 years later, the community was demolished. I can't help but think that whoever sold her that house knew that she wouldn't have it very long. We lived downstairs, my mother, my father, and 8 children. We rented out the basement, the front basement room. My brother slept in the back basement room in the summer when it was cool. I write a lot about this house. When you read the book, you'll recognize this fence. You'll recognize all these things. It was at 2649 Bernard Street, just west of Jefferson. And toward the end of the book, after Mill Creek is demolished, we move to the west end of the city, which is, I think I'm going to read a little bit about that for you. Let's see, I'm going back to the book, and I think I'm going to try to stop sharing and see if you can see me. Here I am. Can you see me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thanks. I can't always tell what's going on. So I'm going to finally read something from the book, and then maybe after that, if there are questions, I'm happy. Jonathan, is that okay? I'm happy to answer questions about the book or about what I've just talked about. Okay, so this is probably around 1959, 60 starts this part. As I got older, I began to understand more of my parents' conversations about the changes in our new neighborhood. The blatant segregation and benign neglect that plagued our old community, they now refer to with new terms, redlining and white flight. Many of the families with children from Mill Creek moved to the newly built federally funded public high-rise Pruitt-Igoe projects. My father had had an accident earlier. This is me kind of inserting so you can have some context here. If Daddy had not received his moderate financial settlement, we no doubt would have had to move to Mill Creek, to Pruitt-Igoe as well. My parents said that the white people who lived in the lovely homes in the far west end of the city, north of Delmar Boulevard, had been sacrificed. Realtors, politicians, and insurance companies had worked together to implement a housing plan without regard for the civil rights or the social norms of all involved, Black or white. It was a foregone conclusion that when a few Black families moved in, the white people would flee, thereby creating space for the displaced. In short order, we were in a segregated community again. As if with a touch of a magic wand, Soldan High School became a Black school, and white churches continued their pilgrimages farther west. St. Paul African American Methodist Episcopal Church had recently relocated a block from our house at the corner of Hamilton and Julian. It had been on an early list of several historic churches that would remain standing in Mill Creek. But in the end, only one small Black church that was supported by the white Presbyterians remained. It wasn't long before the quaint bakery with freshly baked bread, pastries, and donuts closed. Then the well-stocked corner drugstore was replaced with a liquor store. Bookmobiles parked at designated intersections every other Saturday to replace the small branch library that closed at the corner of Hamilton and Eastern, now Martin Luther King. Joe's record store, which replaced the library, streamed soulful music from the outdoor speakers. A laundromat replaced the dry cleaner, and there was no longer a shoe repair shop nearby. Bill Cohen, the Jewish man who owned and operated the corner grocery, held on the longest. National Food Store, the supermarket a few blocks away at Hodemont, closed, and the building became a community social service and job training center. The nearest discount supermarket was a bus ride away. There were so many families with kids in the handsome 4 and 6 family apartment buildings east of our street that the school quickly became overcrowded. First, they built classroom modules in the schoolyard. By 1961, my brother Furman and I were bused back downtown to separate schools in Mill Creek, which by then, thanks to the bombed out landscape, was being called Hiroshima Flats. Our school bus passed acres of desolate wasteland with a few new high-rise buildings jutting upward on the border of St. Louis University. I attended 6th and 7th grade classes in the basement of Vashon High School, which had an unobstructed view of the empty space where my family and friends had lived a few years before. My younger brother and I continued to be bused to separate schools for the remainder of our elementary education. I graduated from 8th grade at Clinton Elementary School with poor white children who had not yet fled downtown's near South Side Clinton Peabody public housing project. In keeping with the St. Louis tradition of segregation, Clinton Peabody had been built for indigent whites on the South Side of downtown in 1947, at the same time that Carr Square Village was built a few miles across 14th Street for Blacks on the North Side. The patterns were repeating. Too many underemployed Black people were being herded into a designated confined area. Many had never owned or maintained homes before, and like us, could scarcely afford to heat them in winter. White flight and disinvestment, followed by an influx of illegal drugs in the 70s, overwhelmed the community. The departure of Black middle class was the final blow. As Alderman Archie Blaine had warned scarcely a decade before, St. Louis's short-sighted leaders had traded one slum for another. Thank you. So that's my little background of my book. So if any of you have read it or have any questions about my presentation, I think I can take them now. Jonathan?
Well, thank you very much, Vivian. That was just really for going into Mill Creek for bringing that alive. And I know when you actually read the book, it's really important to gauge as a city planner. Um, we're not just planning for a city with outlines of bricks and mortar. We're building for people to live, survive, and for their well-being. So the book really it goes into basically, I'm just going to say what a normal community is. There's been so many times where I feel as though with redlining and the scares of, oh no, not these people coming into your neighborhood. Today time we might see it as, less of a white and black issue sometimes. It's more, oh no, like you see a really undesirable car and you're like, oh no, the poor person's moving into my neighborhood now. So there's different levels of that, but back then it was just so blatantly
Blatant.
it was so that you just it this is one of the reasons, and I hope planners on the line kind of on the Zoom kind of get this, is some of the reasons where we are and we just can't move forward is like I refer to the metaphor as no one's gonna go to the store and buy a quilt or a blanket with a big hole in the middle, and because we just keep trying to we call it the hole and we run from it instead of trying to sew it in and make it better to warm the whole person. Otherwise, we just have a big hole in the blanket and you're just going to be cold still. I'm going to call attention to just one of the parts that really brings out um, the community in the book. You talk about Mr. Hong and his family lived above his restaurant and enjoyed the advantage of being located at the busiest intersection of our mostly African American community. And you go on to describe what was there. You noted the People's Finance Building, as you mentioned before, one of the first commercial buildings in the United States built entirely by Black investors. It was the center of American commercial African American commercial, political, and social life in St. Louis. Tenants include the NAACP, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, railroad officers, the Missouri Pacific and Wabash Railroad officers, the two major black newspapers, the American and the Argus. There were doctors, lawyers, insurance officers, a drugstore, and a penthouse ballroom that was booked on most weekends for dancing and large celebrations. The Deluxe Cafe directly across Jefferson at lunchtime was a place to see. You met people normally for business, black politicians, and some white politicians courting votes would be observed routinely eating and shaking hands. Um, it's just we I guess, and getting past, we have come a long way in St. Louis and throughout the United States in getting past some of these. You don't hear the word Negro that many times anymore. Uh, and maybe that word has transformed or evolved into some other less blatant words, but you don't see those anymore. But the reason I particularly read that little excerpt was to look at whenever we talk about, I feel like African Americans a lot of times now or in the past, we don't look for the opportunity that we can bring those people to survive or to succeed and to thrive. We don't look to them as future lawyers, future doctors, or just future helpful people in society. But that's what, we really need to do more. And there are a lot of policies out there that just look at a process. There's a legal process for just about everything. But how does that process actually influence the people? Because
Mhm.
if we're all just about process and we're all following, as you mentioned, Harlan Bartholomew and the 1907 plan, it's been 100 years from now. And at that point, when he wrote that plan, in 1907, you know, 100 years later, a little over 100 years later, and we're still dealing with some of this stuff. But
Mhm.
honestly, not even 50 years before 1907 was the Civil War,
Yeah.
and that is so much more close to. I mean, we're still dealing with. I'm happy that in your book you mentioned that I think Vern and Jenny, one of them went on to receive in 1956 a PhD at St. Louis U.
Mhm.
St. Louis U did not start accepting black people until 1944. So it's just kind of amazing to see how I see it from more, I guess, like your presentation, the academic side, as do a lot of people on here, but there's also that human element. But I'm going to stop going rambling on myself, and I'm going to get to some of these awesome members that we have questions. So I'm going to read a few of these out here. And I just want to note that also Gary Newcomer, one of our members, did mention the church that you mentioned that's still Mill Creek, that Slubon, that's El Monastero that we actually
Maria.
routinely use. So we
Yeah.
all on the line should be familiar with that.
And now it has some Italian name that means monastery or something like that. I think it would be nice for it to at least be called Berea Center or something, just to remind people. Most people don't know, one, that that's even Mill Creek, and certainly two, that that is the lone church.
mm, and that's something now that we know, whenever we walk into it next, we have some more
Yeah,
context on it.
absolutely. So I can start with one question that I happened to read while you were
Yeah.
talking, and it was, how was the land acquired? Um, each alderman was allowed to send in a negotiator. So they had however many wards there were. I don't know if they were 28 then or how many, but they hired negotiators to go in and negotiate selling prices because they had money from the federal government to buy up the land. And it was basically that. I might add that most of the Black people in Mill Creek didn't own their property. So they didn't really get anything for it. A lot of the store on the commercial buildings, the factories, but the people like my grandmother, who was one of very, very few who owned her house. I don't know what she got. I tried very hard to find out exactly how much she got. And I couldn't. But most Black people in Mill Creek did not even own their houses, but they were owned by people who had lived in them, probably formerly lived in those neighborhoods for years and years, and they still maintain them. So anyway, they got money from the government and they paid them off. I have no idea how much. So we have another question.
Yes. Oh, just got out of it. Do you have thoughts on the tendency that planners still use the same language regarding health, open space, etc., to justify modern planning projects that was used back then to justify urban renewal? So today, speaking, any ordinance might have the justification of health, safety, and welfare.
Mhm.
It's almost
Well,
like boilerplate.
those are certainly terms that, any sane person would say, oh, those are good goals. But as I mentioned in my presentation, when they were talking about health, safety, and welfare, very early on, say in 1907, they never mentioned Black people at all because it wasn't really an issue. And later on, they didn't have to mention it. They were talking about just progress and nuisance and destruction and rats, and those were the code words and necessary words to persuade people that it's time to make some changes. But it is disheartening that a lot of those same terms are used, and I hate to think that they're being used for the same reasons.
Thank you. And next question comes from someone who actually I know, because I did give her one of the copies of the signed copy. And I do apologize for the people. I was not in office for part of this week, therefore, and the books are locked in my office. So, so unfortunately, I didn't.
Are you telling me somebody actually did get a chance
Oh
to?
yeah.
Oh,
yeah. Yes.
Great.
So she asks, I know in the book that you wrote that your parents died when you were a young adult. You weren't able to discuss their feelings about it in their lives, but how many others who grew up with you were able to talk about their feelings of this time?
Well, it's an interesting thing. Not only did people not remember or know about it, people were so dispersed and so busy living their lives. I don't think anybody really thought that much about discussing Mill Creek because it had disappeared. But writing this book has brought out quite a bit. I get a lot of discussion, a lot of emails, conversations during these book discussions about people who do in fact remember, people who thank me, people who live there, former residents who actually thank me for writing this book and letting people know that we existed, that we were there, that we were human, and that we survived and we thrived. So that was heartening. But what surprised me more, I think, were people who said that they had no idea that the community ever existed. I have friends who said that they were living their middle class life in Ladue and Kirkwood and Webster Groves and had no idea that there was a Mill Creek, which is really, I guess, was part of the plan.
And actually, it was interesting. I ran into my sisters went to Incarnate Word Academy, an all-girls Catholic school here, and I randomly ran into one of their classmates' fathers who's actually lived in Blue Mire Projects, which is basically sister to Pruitt-Igoe, if you think about that. Pruitt-Igoe's
right, much later.
Basically. Yeah. And he invited me to their 50th anniversary of that, and I went out, and it was just crazy about just how one story at one person. I read this book, and I see a lot of this. Honestly, some of this in myself. Not only, it's just you're not too far off. You might try to separate yourself via actual distance, but it's a really small world, and a lot of this stuff is.
A lot of those people in Blue Mire maybe first were in Pruitt-Igoe, and then they went to Blue Mire. So they're the same people. And that's another interesting, those are other interesting comments that I get. I get a lot of comments from white people saying that those stories were familiar to them too, that they did a lot of those same things. People who grew up in South City said it was the same thing. So, we're not that different. We were all struggling, and it makes me feel really good to hear that people are saying, those are familiar stories to me. We did those same things. And I get a lot of that. A lot of the discussions evolve into We did that too. That was so funny. I remember that sort of thing. So it really makes me feel good that we were isolated, but we created this community that was our own, but was also shared in a lot of ways.
Another question we have, actually from one of the APA members who actually suggested you originally. I actually want to call out Hobie right now.
Yay!
Hobie's a planning student at St. Louis University who also was like, here, look into this. And there he did. And there he is. He popped up on the screen.
Yay! Thank you.
So Hobie asked, why do you think renovation or rehab wasn't considered for urban renewal? We see similar buildings in Lafayette Square and Soulard that are prized today, but with indoor plumbing and hot water. So
Yeah, he's exactly right. It's exactly the same. And 60, 70 years later, they're still in high demand, those houses in Soulard, and they're being redeveloped in North City as well. But they wanted that land. That was the heart. That was the prime real estate of this city. It was straight up from the arch. It was outside of, well, the arch wasn't there yet, but from the riverfront, from the civic center, people coming into the city on trains. A block away was Mill Creek. They wanted the land, and after World War II, when all the soldiers came home, they needed jobs for those soldiers. And Bartholomew's plan was based on automobiles and the fact that soldiers coming back would be able to drive to the suburbs. So they needed highways. And then when President Truman said that he was going to get private industry involved in redeveloping the inner cities, construction companies got involved, cement companies got involved to build these highways. So it was all about creating jobs and industry and a better life for white people. And who was in the way? A bunch of Black people. And there were two bond issues. There was one, I think, in 1947 that failed when they were first trying to get this project off the ground. And basically, the League of Women Voters and the Black newspapers and the NAACP were first against it because there was no place for us to go. We were segregated there because they didn't want us in surrounding neighborhoods. Now, suddenly they wanted the space we were in, but where were we gonna go? So they had to create Pruitt-Igoe. And the idea was take us from Mill Creek and put us in high-rise Pruitt-Igoe. Well, in fact, studies have shown that only about 30% of Mill Creek residents actually went into Pruitt-Igoe. But basically, it was a jobs program for white former soldiers, veterans. It was a means of getting white people to the suburbs. The problem was white people took those highways to the suburbs and didn't come back. They left the city. The city was blocked and couldn't expand into the county. And so we were stuck here in this designated space in the city of St. Louis, and all the white residents and even the Black residents eventually moved out, and the city has never recovered. So I hope that's a lesson to you planners. So I hope I answered this question. I sometimes go off on these tangents, but I think it was a jobs plan, frankly. And because the plan that they had never really did come to fruition. They're still trying to get people to move into the city and into the Mill Creek area. And so all we got out of it was a highway.
So let me ask, as an adult, so if you were living in your house like exactly as it was today, what would you ask from your government and from the community to make it better? So I do understand always the, well, there's a different jobs number and a cost and a taxes associated with renovating, let's say, 5 blocks of just single family housing or putting a new MLS stadium. Those are two different job numbers and economic
Right.
values and all that. But if we just looked at, let's pretend like, let's just go back and it's 1959. What would you ask? How would you want your government to actually get
Well,
involved at the time?
well, first of all, they got free money. The city got free money from the federal government. They didn't have to pay that money back. So if they got money to buy those houses, first of all, if they were building a highway that was on the southern edge of the Mill Creek footprint, why did they need to tear down all the way over to Olive? Why couldn't they have taken what they thought they needed along that southern line and give some of that money, even in low interest loans, since Black people couldn't get any loans anyway, or give them the money that they were giving to as incentives to businesses to come down, the businesses didn't come. Why couldn't that money have gone to individual homeowners to upgrade their houses and their facilities, to put in indoor plumbing, to put on roofs, to reinforce the brick of those old houses exactly the same way they did in Soulard and Lafayette Square? So there were ways to not destroy a complete community, to modernize. Nobody was saying we want to stay in those dilapidated houses because that's where we were and that's where we want to be. There were ways to do that and still give people some humanity and some respect. So I think there was a way to do it. And there was money to be spent. And I think a lot of money was spent that didn't really provide what was proposed.
And I think we're about at the 1 o'clock time, so I'm gonna just get one more comment in. Walter Jacobson called it racial capitalism when
Mhm.
jobs for white people came at the displacement of black people. There are
Yep.
examples of this all over St. Louis from every decade, and I think just going back to that, um, it's important for us to see, what does 20 years mean? Um, and the decisions that we make today, it just can't always be on the new awesome development that we're looking forward to at the highway. Jobs, 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 jobs. There's nothing to do with, if you look at your economic development plans, look at how much schools are into that. Ask those questions about what would be a conducive learning environment for my kid and a conducive, thriving environment for my family, because at the end of the day, the communities that really are more put together are the ones that have just better schools. And that doesn't have to be a segregated issue or a winners and losers issue. It's just what we like to prioritize, what we want to work on, and when we need to speak up as a planner, I mean, know your place and your role, of course, but there are times where you do influence and impact what's on people's minds, and don't be afraid, or just look for ways that you could say, I think we probably need to look at even a fourth or a fifth option, because you honestly did not talk enough about the people who this is going to be impacting the
Right.
most. um,
Absolutely.
but I wanted
And
to
I'm
thank
one
you.
of those people. And
Yes.
I deserved a better life, but I made it. I thrived and I survived.
Yeah, I would say yes. And a lot of this, I mean, even in your book, it talks about, it had the Post Dispatch talking about how it was kind of funny because the comment was about the Post disparaging somebody. And I'm thinking in my mind, that's today. Or you talked about even, and I'm not saying I read the Post Dispatch as well, good and bad articles, but some of them are disparaging. And you saw that 50 years ago. I mean, there are a lot of things that literally you were just trying to live life as an innocent child, and uh let's make sure that opportunity happens and we give all kids the opportunity they need to survive. Because
Yeah.
ultimately, in 20 years from now, that's the strength of our neighborhoods are from the people that we raise there, and the people that will remain there. But know that people have to jump off. I'm already receiving comments saying, Vivian, that was a lovely talk. So I want to thank you very much. Again, my email is writing in the chat, Jonathan Roper at olivetmo.com. If you want to email me about a copy, we have a limited amount of copies. So,
But they have plenty of them in the stores.
yes, yes, at Left Bank Books. That's where I picked up
Left
mine.
Bank Book, support a small business for sure. Novel Neighbors has them. I thank you all so much. I'm promoting this book during a pandemic. All the plans we have for launching this went down the well. So please think about buying this book for a gift for holidays, and send me a note if you enjoy it. You can reach me at vivian.gibson. No, not there. Vivian-gibson.com. Send me a note if you enjoyed my talk, if you enjoyed the book. Any questions that you might have that we didn't get to today, I'll be happy to answer them.
All right, and I put those in the chat for you guys. And the last thing I'll note is just the Missouri Great Places as well. If you want more information, it's in the chat, or just please email me. With that, I'd like to thank you for your time today, and we will see you guys next month at the next December luncheon. Thank you and have a good day.
All right, thank you. I'm getting lots of thanks. That's really nice to read. Thank you, Jonathan. It was my pleasure.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
You were a guinea pig. That's the first time I'd done that slideshow. But I thought it was great information that you all could appreciate.
Of course. Of course. Well.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.